She hasn't worked a single day since college. And now she's stealing from her own dead mother. That's what my father said, under oath, standing in front of a jury that had known him longer than they'd known me. I didn't react. Not a flinch. Not a glance in his direction. Instead, I picked up the small plastic cup of water in front of me and took a slow sip. It tasted metallic, slightly warm, the kind of water that feels like it's been sitting in courthouse pipes for decades. I set it back down carefully without a sound. My name is Elena Vance. I'm 41 years old. And until about 9 seconds ago, I had been sitting quietly in the witness box of the Fairfax County Circuit Court, listening to my father describe a version of me that barely resembled a stranger, let alone his daughter. Now I watched him lift a manila folder like it was proof of something sacred. His face had flushed to a deep, dusty red. His voice carried easily across the courtroom, filling the space with the same authority he'd used for years. At council meetings, at public hearings, even at our own dinner table. To everyone else, Robert Vance wasn't just my father. He was power. For 3 decades he had been the man who decided things, who got approval, who got denied, who belonged and who didn't. And in his version of reality, I was the daughter who walked away. The disappointment. The absence. She's a ghost, he told the jury, his tone almost theatrical. Ask anyone in town. No one has seen Elena in 15 years. He held up the folder again, letting the gesture linger. She claims she works for some logistics company in Washington, D.C. But there's no office. No website. My investigators couldn't find a single trace of it. Nothing but empty space where a career should be. He paused, letting silence do its work. She spent her entire adult life living off whatever scraps her mother gave her. And now that my wife is gone, she's here to take what's left. My eyes shifted not to him, but to the gallery. Ashley sat in the front row. My younger sister. 7 years between us and a lifetime of carefully maintained appearances. She wore a soft designer cardigan, one I recognized immediately because I had paid for it through a quiet account 3 years ago. Her gaze stayed lowered, hands folded in her lap, playing her role perfectly. The grieving daughter. The betrayed sister. She didn't look at me. He didn't have to. In this room they had already decided who I was. Robert had been working on her for months. Quiet conversations. Careful suggestions. Repeating the same story until it sounded like truth. That I was a burden, a parasite, someone who had drifted through life without purpose. Ashley accepted it. Or maybe she accepted the version that came with a larger share of the inheritance. Inside me the anger wasn't loud. It didn't burn. It sharpened. Pulled. Controlled. Precise. The same focus I used in rooms where hesitation cost lives. I let my gaze drift to the back of the courtroom and realized something almost impressive. They hadn't just misunderstood me. They had erased me. Completely. Back at the farmhouse, Robert hadn't left anything to chance. He had executed a quiet purge. Letters sent to everyone who mattered in town. The pastor, the hardware store owner, the local board. Each one rewriting me into something small. A dependent. A disappointment. A cautionary tale. I thought back to the last time I walked through that house. It was after my mother's funeral. I remember stepping into the hallway and stopping. The wall where my university honors used to hang. Gone. The frame that once held my ROTC commissioning portrait. Gone. All that remained was a pale rectangle where the wallpaper hadn't faded, and a cheap calendar from a tractor dealership. Like I had never existed. Like I had been something temporary. Something he had outgrown. There's a name for that feeling. The validation gap. That hollow space that forms when the people who raised you decide your worth is nothing. Simply because they can't understand what you've become. Ms. Vance. Gerald Davis, my father's attorney, stepped closer with a thin smile. Can you provide this court with a single verifiable piece of evidence that you've held gainful employment in the last 10 years? A pay stub, a tax return, anything that isn't a shadow. I looked at him. Then at my father. Robert leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, completely at ease. Certain. He believed in paper trails. In visibility. In records that could be stamped and filed. He believed that if something couldn't be seen, it didn't exist. I work in operations analysis, I said calmly. My clients require discretion. The records exist. Your inability to access them isn't my failure. It's your limitation. Robert laughed. Dismissive. Discretion, he scoffed. You were a paper pusher, Alina. A glorified clerk. Don't dress up laziness with fancy words. The sound echoed through the courtroom. I felt the small weight of the silver phoenix pin against my chest. He had no idea. While he sat in diners arguing about feed prices and county budgets, I had been sitting in secure rooms without windows, making decisions that never made headlines, but changed outcomes all the same. 15 years in silence. 15 years of letting them believe I was less, because the truth wasn't mine to share. He'll know. He sat there, smug, convinced my life was empty because it wasn't visible. To him, success meant recognition. Applause. A name people repeated. He didn't understand the cost of silence. We have a phrase for it. The price of being the shield. You don't get credit. You don't get acknowledgement. You get a secure line, a locked door, and a life no one can verify. Sometimes, you get a family that mistakes your silence for failure. They had no idea how much of their comfort had been built by hands they refused to see. When the dairy farm nearly collapsed in 2018, Robert believed he'd been saved by a last-minute agricultural grant. It wasn't luck. It was $136,000 of my own earnings, moved through layers of distance so he would never have to admit where it came from. Ashley's master's degree? An anonymous alumni scholarship. My mother's treatments when insurance failed? Covered before the bills ever reached the mailbox. I had been there. Just never in a way they were willing to recognize. And now, sitting in that courtroom listening to my father reduce me to nothing, I realized something simple. Silence had protected them long enough. The jury's gaze settled on me like a verdict already forming, cold, certain, and heavy with everything they thought they knew. I didn't react. Not to Ashley's trembling performance. Not to my father's quiet satisfaction. Not even to the accusation of fraud hanging in the air like something final. I just sat there. So composed. Waiting. Because this was the moment they had all been building toward. The story they had rehearsed, polished, and delivered with perfect confidence. And they believed it would hold. My hands rested lightly in my lap, steady, controlled, the same way they had been in rooms where panic cost lives and hesitation closed doors you could never reopen. Forgery. That was the angle. Not just failure. Not just absence. But theft. Betrayal. A daughter feeding off her dying mother. It would have been convincing, if I hadn't already seen every piece of it coming. Ashley's voice cracked at exactly the right moments. Gerald Davis stood tall like a man presenting something airtight. And my father. He looked almost calm now, like this was the part where everything finally aligned in his favor. A lifetime of control distilled into one clean narrative. I let the silence stretch just a second longer. Then I turned my head slightly toward my attorney. He didn't move right away. He didn't need to. We had learned the same lesson in very different worlds. Timing matters more than volume. The sealed envelope in his briefcase hadn't been touched yet. Not during my father's testimony. Not during Ashley's performance. Not even when the word fraud landed in the center of the courtroom. Because truth, when it arrives too early, gets buried. But when it arrives at the exact moment a lie feels complete, it doesn't just interrupt. It dismantles. I lifted my gaze to the jury again, meeting their eyes one by one. They weren't cruel people. They were certain people. And certainty, I had learned, is far more dangerous. Your Honor, my attorney said calmly, rising to his feet. The defense would like to respond to Exhibit 12. Gerald Davis smiled faintly, already confident. Of course, the judge replied. That was when my attorney reached down, opened his briefcase, and finally placed the sealed envelope on the table. The room shifted. Subtle but real. Because something in the way he handled it, careful, deliberate, made it clear this wasn't just a response. It was an answer. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. For years, I had lived in silence while they rewrote me into something small enough to dismiss. But silence doesn't erase truth. It just stores it. And now, for the first time in that courtroom, I wasn't the one being defined. I was the one about to define everything. To them, I was simple. A woman who left, forgot where she came from, and came back to take what wasn't hers. I could feel it in the room. That quiet, heavy judgment pressing in from every side. But I didn't reach for my lawyer. I didn't even look at Robert. I looked at the courtroom doors. Is that all? I asked softly. Robert let out a sharp laugh. Is that all? You've been caught, Alina. You're a thief and a liar. Mr. Vance, sit down, Judge Miller warned, though his voice carried a strange distraction. His eyes flicked, again, to the silver phoenix pin on my lapel. I turned to my attorney, Marcus Thorne. Marcus wasn't from here. He didn't posture. Didn't perform. He moved like a man who had already seen worse rooms than this and never needed to prove it. He stood, opened his briefcase and spoke in a calm, even tone that settled the courtroom instantly. Your Honor, the plaintiff's investigation was thorough, by civilian standards. But it was searching for a person who, by design, does not exist in public systems. A faint ripple moved through the gallery. Since allegations of criminal fraud have been raised, he continued, my client has been granted a limited disclosure authorization. He placed a heavy black envelope on the table. Stamped with a gold eagle. We request to submit a verified statement of service and employment, cleared for judicial review. Robert's confidence didn't vanish all at once. It flickered, uneven, uncertain. Gerald Davis stepped forward, frowning. What is that supposed to be? It's exactly what you've been asking for, Marcus replied. As he approached the bench, something in the room shifted. Not louder. Not dramatic. Just different. Judge Miller leaned forward slightly. Counselor, are you stating this contains classified material? I am, Your Honor. With limited clearance granted for this court. Robert pushed to his feet, chair scraping loudly. This is a stunt. She's nothing. I've seen her life. Sit down, Mr. Vance, Miller snapped, sharper this time, eyes never leaving me. Or rather, never leaving the pin. He knew it. Not as decoration. Not as sentiment. Recognition. The kind you only get in places no one talks about. The judge took the envelope. Opened it carefully, almost deliberately slow. The room held its breath. Paper slid free. He read. Once. Then again. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. He removed his glasses and set them down. And when he looked up, the man on the bench wasn't just a county judge anymore. He was something older. Sharper. Someone who understood exactly what he was holding. Mr. Davis, he said, voice low but carrying through the entire room, your case is built on the claim that Alina Vance does not exist in any meaningful capacity. Pause. You've accused her of fraud. Of deception. Of living without purpose. His gaze shifted to Robert. I am now holding a verified statement issued through federal authority. The silence deepened. It confirms that Alina Vance has maintained continuous, classified employment for over 15 years. Robert didn't move. Didn't blink. It further confirms, the judge continued, that her identity has been deliberately obscured under government directive. A faint, strangled sound came from Ashley. The organization you dismissed, Miller added, his voice tightening, is not fictitious. It is a sanctioned cover structure. He let that settle. Then delivered the part that changed everything. The absence you pointed to as proof of failure is, in fact, evidence of her service. The room didn't erupt. It didn't gasp. It went cold. Because in that moment, every assumption they had made, every certainty they carried into that courtroom, collapsed quietly under the weight of something they couldn't argue with. And for the first time since I'd taken that seat, they weren't looking at a ghost anymore. They're not gaps, Judge Miller said, his voice steady but carrying a new weight. They're proof of what she's done. He looked at me then, and for the first time in years I wasn't invisible. Bailiff, secure the doors. This court is now in camera. No one leaves. The shift was immediate. What had been a public spectacle collapsed into something controlled, contained, serious. And Mr. Davis, Miller added, I strongly advise you to consider withdrawing this complaint. Quickly. Robert tried to speak, but the words broke apart in his throat. She was just an analyst. That's what she told us. I leaned forward slightly, my voice low, precise. I told you what you were cleared to hear, Robert. You didn't want the truth. You wanted a version of me that made sense to you. Silence followed, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was sharp. Robert looked smaller. Not physically, but in a way that mattered more. His hands, those steady, unshakable hands, were trembling now. Gerald Davis didn't argue. Didn't object. He just stared at the floor, already understanding the damage couldn't be undone. Judge Miller clasped his hands together. This complaint is dismissed with prejudice. Each word landed clean. The court is also issuing sanctions in the amount of $45,200 for legal costs and administrative burden. Additionally, $50,000 in damages is awarded to the defendant for defamation. Payment to be made immediately from the plaintiff's personal share of the estate. Robert's mouth moved but nothing came out. Ashley had turned away, her face buried in her hands. Whatever alliance they had built dissolved the second it required accountability. Alina. Robert finally managed. We didn't know. How were we supposed to know? I stood. There was no surge of triumph. No adrenaline. Just clarity. You weren't supposed to know everything, I said. But you were supposed to know me. I stepped out of the witness box and walked toward the gallery. The daughter who worked beside you in those fields didn't just become a parasite because she left town. I passed him without stopping. The nurse's bills, I added quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. The money that kept this place afloat 4 years ago. That was me. Pause. I didn't do it for the legacy. I did it because my mother loved you. Then I kept walking. That debt is settled. I pushed through the courthouse doors into the marble hallway, the air cooler, cleaner, like stepping out of a story that no longer had any hold on me. Marcus caught up near the elevator and handed me my briefcase. No congratulations, he said lightly. I almost smiled. We don't use that word, I replied. The director wants a debrief at 0800, he added. Said your restraint was noted. I wasn't being restrained, I said as the elevator doors opened. I was finishing the equation. Outside, the morning had already begun. I reached my car and sat for a moment looking at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The silver phoenix pin caught the light. For years I had made myself smaller, quieter, easier to dismiss. I unclipped the pin and placed it carefully into its case. Then I started the engine. As I pulled out and headed toward the rising light, one thing settled clearly in my mind. I wasn't disappearing anymore. I wasn't something to be rewritten, reduced, or erased. I was done being their version of me. From here on, I write the story.